Harvey Mindus, a practicing psychologist and a professor at UCLA, is the author of a marvelous book entitled Laughter and Liberation, in which he points out that everyone seems to realize the importance of a sense of humor and agrees that it's one of our most valuable faculties. Thinkers, simple and profound, declare that the ability to see the funny side of things and to laugh at ourselves and our troubles is an asset of the greatest magnitude. It can help us contend with adversity, derive greater joy out of living, and maintain our sanity, yet no one seems to know how to cultivate it. The kind of humor that deserves to be called therapeutic is not the kind that enjoys jokes and comic routines. For delightful as they may be, they are contrived and superficial, bearing about the same relation to therapeutic humor as pretty pictures do to real art. The kind of sense of humor that can help us maintain our sanity moves beyond jokes, beyond wit, beyond laughter itself. It must constitute a frame of mind, a point of view, a deep-going, far-reaching attitude to life. A cluster of qualities characterizes this peculiar frame of mind, and here some of them are. Flexibility. In this case, a person's willingness to examine every side of every issue and every side of every side. Spontaneity. His ability to leap from one mood or mode of thought to another. Unconventionality. His freedom from the values of his time, his place, and his profession. Shrewdness. His refusal to believe that anyone, least of all himself, is what he seems to be. Playfulness. His grasp of life as a game, a tragic-comic game that nobody wins, but that does not have to be won to be enjoyed. And humility, that elusive quality exemplified by the rabbi in this traditional story. A wise old rabbi lay dying, so his disciples lined up next to his deathbed to catch his final words. They arranged themselves in order from the most brilliant pupil to the most obtuse. The brilliant one bent over the prostrate form and whispered, "Rabbi, what are your final words?" "My final words," murmured the ancient rabbi, "are, life is a river." The disciple passed it on to the person next to him, and the phrase traveled like wildfire down the line. When it reached the oath at the end, however, he scratched his head in perplexity. "What does the rabbi mean, life is a river?" he asked. The question, of course, traveled back up the line. "What does the rabbi mean, life is a river?" When the star pupil heard it, he leaned over again. "Rabbi," he implored, for the old man was breathing his last, "what do you mean, life is a river?" And the rabbi shrugged and croaked, "So it's not a river." A man who can shrug off the insufficiency of his ultimate wisdom, the meaninglessness of his profoundest thoughts, is a man in touch with the very soul of humor, and each of the 6 qualities contributes to the kind of sense of humor that is therapeutic. The 6 qualities are the kind of sense of humor each of us needs: flexibility, willingness to examine every side of an issue, spontaneity, unconventionality, shrewdness, playfulness, and humility. So how's your sense of humor these days? Do you know what typifies the healthy-minded, mature person perhaps more than anything else? To my mind, it's the simplicity of his needs. St. Francis of Assisi said, "I need little, and that little I need very little." If you'll think back to the truly great men and women of our time, and going all the way back in recorded history, you'll find that their lives were characterized by simplicity. Think of Edison, Einstein, Schweitzer, Gandhi. The list is endless, going all the way back to the great teachers of antiquity: Buddha, Socrates, Epictetus, Moses, Christ, all the truly great ones. And their lives were typified by their lack of the weight of possessions, their freedom from being owned by things, gadgets, gewgaws, junk. After his crucifixion, Christ left a robe and a movement that was to change the world. The possessions of Gandhi, following his assassination, could be held in one hand. Now they were all people who lived in the spiritual and mental realms. They were not concerned with their own earthly existence, and we cannot be like them. The completely ascetic life is not attractive to us because we haven't grown inwardly to the point where we can become a Thoreau or a William Yeats. But we can simplify our lives until we have them under our control instead of it being the other way around. Our highly industrialized, technological society could not exist 6 months without the farmer. But the farmer could exist all his life and raise a fine family without modern industry or technology, although it would be admittedly much tougher on him. I'm glad we've progressed industrially and technologically to the point we've reached. It's great having the things we need in such abundance, but it's also good to decide upon what it is we need for a good and abundant life, because if you're not careful, it's possible for your possessions to own you. I was on a television show with Zsa Zsa Gabor many years ago, and noticing the enormous diamond she was wearing, asked her if she was afraid of being attacked and robbed, and she said no. A few months later, or perhaps it was a couple of years, I read in the paper that she had been attacked and beaten in an elevator of a New York hotel and her diamond stolen. It had not been insured. Now, all that problem and risk and ultimate loss because of going overboard on the size of a diamond. And a good question is, do I own the things I own for my own pleasure and convenience, or to impress those about me? Getting back to that maturity business, the really mature person couldn't care less if he or she impresses anyone or not. Sometimes people in show business have to go to extremes for publicity, and it's good for their careers. It's a good investment for them unless it endangers their lives and limbs. But if you're interested in making an assessment of your degree of maturity, look at the things you think are important in your life. The mature person carries his important possessions within. He or she isn't concerned too much about what others may think, nor does he or she need to make an impression on anyone. They see life in the world in a clearer, truer light. How many times have you heard a woman say, well, it's what they're wearing this year, which is another way of saying, this is the current uniform, or whatever they wear, I will wear. And men are just as bad. If the style is drooping Jesse James gunfighter-type mustaches, you'll see them adorning male upper lips from Maine to California. You'll see them in your rear-view mirror of your car and all about you on the street. Whatever starts out as something new and different immediately becomes the commonplace. The desire to copy others is so deeply ingrained in the human organism as to be a constant source of amazement, until you remember the wise words of our friend Jose Ortega y Gasset. It is the natural state of man to find himself disoriented in his world. He is seeking orientation, a path to follow. And if others seem to know what they're doing or where they're going, well, he'll quickly get in line. Few people in our society are sufficiently mature, sufficiently wise, to go their own way regardless of the ebb and flow of fads and fashions. Few women have the kind of inner composure and are sure enough of what they like to pick their wardrobes from their own likes and dislikes and wear them, not in spite of the crowd, but in the simple, independent desire to wear those clothes that most please them. It isn't a matter of men or women. It's a matter of human beings who've never developed a way of their own in the world. It isn't that the independent, free person wants to be an iconoclast and stand out as a character in the crowd. Just the opposite. He doesn't care if he stands out or not. He doesn't need to stand out. He's content with his evolving self. He's growing. He hopes to get better, but he's satisfied with his progress. It's perfectly natural that the person who lacks inner direction will seek to find direction in a group of some kind. This is not to say we should not belong to organizations, only that we should try to find out what is important to us and go our own way, or perhaps I should say, grow our own way. I was rereading Dana's great classic, 2 years before the mast, and his description of California and its people back in the 1830s when it still belonged to Mexico, and of his fascinating adventures as an ordinary seaman. And he mentions that when the sailors on his ship got an occasional liberty, they would go to the nearest saloon, get thoroughly plastered, and finally be stripped of their possessions and tossed into the pokey, where they would have to be ransomed the next morning. Now, he found it curious that sailors saw how fast they could become unconscious on their rare opportunities to go ashore. He, on the other hand, explored the countryside, met and talked with the people, learned the Spanish language, and kept notes in a journal that was to someday become a world classic and do much to raise the standard of living and the pay of sailors everywhere. He was the one man on the ship that didn't go with the traditional conduct of sailors, and he's the one that accomplished something. To be great at anything is to be a nonconformist. Mark Twain once said, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to reform. It isn't a matter of going against the trends of the time. It's simply a matter of going your own way. Norman Cousins, in an editorial for the Saturday Review, observed, We have been concerned for some years with the lot of underprivileged people throughout the world, but we have yet to do anything for one of the most underprivileged of all, ourselves. We have more food than we can eat. We have more money per person than anywhere else in the world. With 6% of the population, we hold 80% of the wealth. We have bigger homes, bigger TV sets, bigger cars, bigger theaters, bigger schools. We have everything we need, in fact, except the most important thing of all, time to think and the habit of thought. We lack time for the one indispensable for safety of an individual or a nation. Thought is the basic energy in human history. Civilization is put together not by machines, but by thought. Similarly, man's uniqueness is represented not by his ability to make objects, but to sort them and relate them. Other animals practice communications. Only man has capacity for comprehension. Displace or eliminate thought, and the species itself has, well, as little claim on survival as the dinosaurs with their 4-foot skulls and the pea-sized brains. The impotence of the brute alongside the power of the sage is represented by thought. We seem to have no time for thought. The paradox, of course, is that we're busy doing nothing. Never before has so much leisure time been available to so many. Leisure hours now exceed working hours. But we have a genius for cluttering. We've somehow managed to persuade ourselves that we're too busy to think, too busy to read, too busy to look back, too busy to look ahead, too busy to understand that all our wealth and all our power are not enough to safeguard our future unless there's also a real understanding of the danger that threatens us and how to meet it. Thus, being busy is more than merely a national passion. It's a national excuse. The real question, however, concerns not the time or lack of it we provide for thought, but the value we place on thought. What standing does thoughtfulness enjoy in the community at large? What great works of contemporary literature assign importance to thought or make heroes of thoughtful men? Action, accumulation, diversion, these seem to be the great imperatives. We're so busy increasing the size and ornamentation of our personal kingdoms that we're unaware that no age in history has had as many loose props under it as our own. Interesting, isn't it? How much time do you spend in thought? How much attention to thought is paid in school, in the home, in your home? People yell that they want more. It's impossible to think with the mouth open. And as long as we live, we'll never learn anything of value when we're talking, or yelling, or demanding. What is needed, most assuredly, is more quiet, reflective, creative thinking. Lincoln once said, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves." On a national and individual basis, we need to define our priorities, organize them in the order of their importance, and attack them with creative thought, realizing that we need new solutions to new problems. We need to set aside a time each day for thought. I came across an interesting idea while reading in my office today. See what you think of it. What we have come to call the counterculture is actually an interlocking net of ideas for alternative living, different in crucial ways from the traditional middle class, and yet reflecting characteristically traditional aspirations. And this counterculture's progressively greater impact becomes a powerful motor for social change. Now, what it means is that the great changes in ideas of what constitutes a meaningful life are not so much an attempt to pull down the old traditional ways of living, but rather they are alternatives. They're experiments in alternatives, designed to find new and better ways of living in a more enlightened age. The key term today is alternatives, meaning articulated options beyond the realm of current practice. The younger people, often called the counterculture, are aware that the world they find themselves in today isn't going to win many prizes in the happiness and joy departments. It's a curious thing, but people were much happier in this country back in the 30s and 40s, even the 50s, than they seem to be today. Affluence has brought with it a pervasive dissatisfaction and irritability that didn't used to exist. Having more of the things they thought they wanted has not made people noticeably kinder, more unselfish, nor more cheerful than they used to be. In former days, it seemed as though everybody knew what he wanted. He knew what was important, what the priorities were, at least in his own life. Today, people appear to be rootless, drifting, aimless. They want more, but they don't seem willing to do more. Now, I'm not saying that all the ideas coming from the younger generation are good, but neither are they all bad just because they come from people under 25 or 30. The quotation I used earlier is from an interesting essay entitled Alternative Thinking by Richard Castellanos, which appeared in The Humanist and was adopted from his book, Human Alternatives, published by Morrow. We will all certainly agree, I think, that we need some alternatives to war as a way of life, or rather death. We need alternatives to the carnage on the highway, to the choked ghettos of our city, to increasing pollution. You know, to Buckminster Fuller, pollution is nothing more than resources we're not harvesting. And I have agreed for years that the more reasonable solutions for pollution today involve not less technology, but more, regardless of added expense. It's impossible to turn back the clock, as well as undesirable. What is needed is to turn it forward, to find a human second wind. Freedom from some of the threatening forces with which we're faced today, and a renewal of interest, even excitement, with regard to man and his future. I'm delighted that we have this so-called counterculture coming up with alternative ideas for a more meaningful kind of living. It's as ridiculous and stupid for older people to attempt to disregard the ideas of those under 25 as it is for those under 25 to disregard the ideas and solid accomplishments of those over 30. Have you ever thought about the fact that 99% of our business dealings are with the lowest paid, least interested, and poorest trained people of an organization? We deal with the checkout people and the bag boy, the receptionist, the telephone operator of our company, and in our financial transactions with the person behind the counter. When something goes wrong with one of our appliances, we don't deal with the president of a company or other high-ranking official. We deal with the serviceman or woman, usually man, and in the case of our car, with the service manager and the mechanic. With the transportation company, well, it's the bus driver or the ticket taker. With the airlines, it's the reservation girl, the person behind the counter, or the stewardess. It's the same with virtually all of our myriad transactions. That's the way it has to be, of course, and for the most part, the people with whom we deal are fine people with a genuine interest in doing a good job. But in all but a very few notable cases, the great bulk of these fine people have not been thoroughly indoctrinated with the company's goals and problems, nor do they receive from the company material calculated to help them grow and mature as persons. Company officers will say the growth and maturity of these people as persons is their own problem and responsibility. And while that's regrettably the case, leaving people to obtain that kind of information on their own is to make certain that 95% of them will do nothing about it. Now, what the business community overlooks is that people are eager for growth, and that as they grow and mature as persons, that growth and maturity is reflected in everything they do, on the job and off. Few top corporate executives have any idea of the almost unbelievable latent force for growth that exists within the people they're now paying. With no increase in personnel, their present people can easily do twice what they're now doing, and perhaps a good deal more than that. Not because they're forced or coerced into doing more, but because they can learn the fun and interest and growth that can be obtained by bringing more of themselves to bear on their lives, all departments of their lives. The fact is that most people, including these top corporate executives, are operating on from 5 to 10% of their true capacity. They are, as Dr. William James of Harvard liked to put it, only half awake, and the great majority are getting by, as Huxley discovered, without too much discredit. The answer, in my opinion, is a steady stream of interesting educational material aimed at motivating a person to push back his mental horizons and see himself as an original, enormously creative and competent person with deep, largely unplumbed reservoirs of ability, even genius, which he has probably habitually failed to use, for the simple reason that to get by in our society, he doesn't have to. There's a perfectly natural tendency on the part of most people to pattern their lives after the lives of those by whom they're habitually surrounded. Lacking the kind of leadership they could have, they passively mold themselves, for the most part, into their existing environment. Poking around in the files, I ran across this item I'd clipped from an old newspaper. It's the United Press story, dateline San Pedro, California, and has to do with a family that inherited $200,000. What did they do with it? They blew it, as they put it, and today they're right back where they were before. The mother of 4 children, who lives with her husband and family in a rented home in San Pedro, inherited the money from her father's estate. It took 2 years for the lawyers to haggle and the government to scrape off its stake, the lawyers to divvy up as much as they could lay their hands on, and when the smoke cleared 1 year later, there was a sum of $200,000 left after all taxes and expenses. That's a tidy sum. Properly invested, it could grow into $1 million before too long. But they managed to go through it in just 1 year. When asked how they managed to do it, the wife replied, well, we bought cars and motorcycles for the 2 boys and a truck and a $2,000 hi-fi with all the components and clothes, and we put a down payment on a house, and the girls and I all had our teeth kept, and I had my breasts lifted, and, oh yes, we bought ski equipment, and we traveled. We put 200,000 miles on one of the cars in 1 year, and we all saw psychiatrists. It seems all that money pulled the family right together, and they grimly went about the business of unloading it as fast as someone could think of something to buy, and it was only after the money was gone that the recriminations began. As the briefly rich daughter of the deceased put it, we started fighting. They kept saying, why didn't we spend it this way? Why did you spend it that way? But they were there to spend it. If she had it all to do over again, well, she said, if our family was smart, we would have bought a few luxuries and invested the rest of the money. But did she honestly believe they'd do it that way? Nope, she said, I'd do exactly the same thing I did. I'd blow it. Well, I hope they had fun. It's their business, their money. But the day may come when they're a bit older that they'll start hitting each other over the head for not putting at least some of that loot to pasture, to grow for those important retirement years. The father could have avoided his daughter and her husband going on that 1-year spree if he had left a will and the money in trust for them. It would also have avoided the legal fees and the Uncle Sam's big bucket, and probably would have grown to $500,000 or so, with plenty of money still going to the daughter and her family, who could have gradually spent much more money for many more things over a much longer period of time, and still ended up well-to-do in their retirement years. Well, let's make sure we have a will. An attorney will help us draw one up so that what we leave will be disposed of as we think it ought to be. After all, it's our estate. I noticed that she mentioned last that they all saw a psychiatrist. Maybe that was their mistake. Maybe they should have seen him first. But it was their money. And as she said, when it finally came, it really wore us out spending it. We were just exhausted. In his fine book, Embers of the Mind, Scott Buchanan wrote, imagination is the medium in which all things are done. And I think it was our old friend Henry Miller who said, imagination is everything. And to paraphrase Kant, your imagination is the condition for the possibility of experience. I don't think we've given enough thought or attention to the importance of imagination. Under certain circumstances, imagination is a torment. We imagine all manner of terrors in the dark of night, before a visit to the dentist or physician, or when we're called on the carpet. The steer, as he walks toward swift extinction in the packing house, suffers no terrors of the imagination. The blow falls upon a creature experiencing only mild anxiety, perhaps in the presence of strange surroundings. But the condemned human being dies 1,000 times in his imagination. But while the imagination is a scourge, it's also our hope and joy, and, as Scott Buchanan said, it is the medium in which all things are done. It is the seat of self-fulfilling prophecy as we plan for the goal we've decided to reach. It's the autopilot of our lives, and it works all its life on problems. And here there seem to be 2 main classes of imagination. Those that concentrate on the problem and its possible dire consequences, and those that concentrate on the solution. Now, in the first case, life is a reflection of the problems on which the imagination is focused. In the second, it's a matter of solutions, of overcoming problems. We tend to forget that our opportunities are an exact ratio to our problems. I'm sure there are a few glaring exceptions to that, but it's generally true. The greatest and most successful industries are nothing more than those evolving solutions to problems. The illuminating and heating and cooking industries, the telephone, steel, automobile, and airplane, my bookshelves, my typewriter, my clothes, my home, they're all solutions to problems. Today, mankind is faced with towering problems, and his opportunities match them. Think of the hundreds of thousands of people who will one day be gainfully employed in the pollution control industry and in population control. Look at the growth of medicine, of the pharmaceutical industry. Billions of dollars will be earned in disposing of and recycling trash and garbage, all major problems. It reminds me of the old question, whenever there's something wrong, are you part of the problem or part of the answer? It was just some 9,000 years ago that we began banding together in communities and husbanding crops and animals. Since then, every time a human creature stopped what he was doing and got a questioning look on his face, his imagination was at work. And if we can do what we have done in just the past 100 years, there are no problems our imaginations can't solve in the future. Imagination is the medium in which all things are done. How are you doing in the imagination department? In the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted in his journal that American prosperity would go on to madness. And in René Dubos's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, So Human an Animal, he writes, "In the past, great prosperity has often damaged human values and generated boredom. The environmental crisis in the modern world indicates, furthermore, that mismanaged prosperity may destroy human life altogether. Prosperity is a strange and wonderful and terrifying thing where human beings are concerned. It does wonders for a nation up to a point, and the same goes for any organization of value. Prosperity means good health up to a point, and then it militates against good health. Cardiovascular disease has become a modern plague in the United States, with 20 other countries having longer average lifespans, for no other reason than the fact that too many Americans have grown too fat. Prosperity can put a pacemaker in the heart of an infant otherwise doomed, and then kill him 10 to 20 years sooner than he might otherwise live by fattening him to death. As a general rule, prosperity does not bring out the best in a people. Up to a point, yes. Beyond that point, no. You know, in tests with chimpanzees, it was discovered that the young get along perfectly together, playing happily with virtually no discord whatever, until a possession is introduced into the group and given to one chimp. That chimp immediately becomes violently possessive, and the other chimps become restive, wanting whatever it is the one has. It destroys their relationship and introduces sullenness and bickering where before there was happiness and play. It often works the same way with nations or a community, and it seems people have a way of getting their priorities all fouled up. It's believed that much of the dissatisfaction found in so many millions of people who seem to be rushing headlong in shallow circles is due to mistaken priorities. They're affluent, all right, but often lack the maturity to determine what's really important and good and what isn't. They get confused about what things are simply means to an end and what things are ends in themselves. And after 20 years or so have slipped by, they find themselves standing in the middle of a great collection of junk, which is all in various stages of obsolescence. They often appear like children in a room full of toys, too many toys, so many toys that they're bored to death with toys. As René Dubos put it, in the past, great prosperity has often damaged human values and generated boredom. It seems to many people who have an immature sense of values that there's nothing more to buy. So now what do? Like wind-up toys that have run down, they stand in the midst of all that they once wanted and find that it's not enough. Not nearly enough. I want to share with you a letter written by a young lady, a senior at McLean High School. She writes, "I was raised as a virtually free American in Watts, a section of Los Angeles that has been called a slum by sightseers and a depressed area by sociologists. As a child, I never noticed. We had an overabundance of unsightly tenements, smelly pool rooms, dirty streets, and flying garbage, yet I never felt underprivileged, depressed, or deprived. To outsiders, my environment might have appeared to be miserable, but in all honesty, I must say that I was not aware of this. I can be considered fortunate because poverty never destroyed or even damaged my ideas or standards. Sociologists would probably label me as the privileged poor, and indeed I am privileged. But poor, I am not. Henry Ward Beecher once said, 'No man can judge whether he is rich or poor by turning to his ledger. It is the heart that makes men rich. He is rich according to what he is, not what he has.' We moved out of Watts, and 6 years later I began to hear rumors of what I, a person from a slum, was supposed to be. For the first time in my life I realized that Watts had been pictured in many people's minds as a 20th century Tobacco Road. This was after the riots. This was when mass media began to degrade not only Watts, but all lower middle-class communities as well. After the riots, scores of projects were started. Everyone thought he knew the answer. They thought the answer was money. The money began to pour in, trying to force upper middle-class standards on a lower middle-class society. The front-page headlines told of how the people didn't have the money to buy the necessities of life, yet they'd existed, survived, and lived for many years. As time passed, The people began to believe the stories themselves. They no longer wanted to live happily as they had in the past, not luxuriously, but contentedly. Now they saw themselves as others saw them. They felt cheated and left out. The more money that poured in, the more money was needed to satisfy this new thirst. Now Father can go to work and feel like a slave for 8 hours a day, and Sis can't go to school because her clothes aren't good enough. You can bet that when they sit down to meatloaf, they think of others eating steak. All the bills in the legislature can't stop poverty. All the money in the treasury can't buy poverty. People cannot advance as a group until they have the desire to do so. In order for the poor to come out of poverty, they must take the first step themselves. As a teenager, and as a former citizen of Watts, I feel that now is the time to inform the younger generation that they can change the present conditions when they accept the fact that no one owes them anything. That now is the time to take the first step out of the impoverished area. As Booker T. Washington phrased it, cast down your buckets where you are. I am, according to books, magazines, and movies, an underprivileged, deprived, depressed person with supposedly no hope for the future. But I stand as a symbol. You can be what you want to be, not disregarding your background, but quite often because of it. This high school senior ended her letter by writing, "But I stand as a symbol. You can be what you want to be, not disregarding your background, but quite often because of it." I hope this girl's letter gets wide dissemination. Thank you.